Control of Middle East oil is for the first time not a sure thing, first time in 80 years. These expectations are also threatened by developments in the Western Hemisphere, which have been accelerated. They're going on by themselves, but they've been accelerated by Bush administration policies that have left the United States remarkably isolated in the global arena. The Bush administration has even succeeded in alienating Canada. That takes real talent. But they did. The reason is that they've rejected NAFTA decisions favoring Canada, which doesn't make Canada very happy. And the Canadian ministers have announced that they'll accelerate the establishment of Canada-China relations. Canadian officials have said that Canada may shift a significant portion of its trade, including oil, from the United States to China. Well, next to Venezuela, Canada is the main oil supplier. In a further blow to Washington's energy policies, the leading exporter in the hemisphere, Venezuela, has forged the closest relations with China of any Latin American country, and it's planning to sell increasing amounts of oil to China as part of its efforts to diversify, to reduce its dependence on a very hostile U.S. government, all completely predictable, incidentally. Latin America as a whole is increasing trade and other relations with China. Some setbacks, but it's very likely to expand, particularly for the raw materials exporters like Brazil and Chile, but Venezuela is the most important. Meanwhile, for the first time since the Spanish conquest, Latin America is moving towards closer internal integration, independent of Washington. That's dramatic and important. Venezuela has just joined the South American Customs Union, Mercosur. Argentine President Kirchner describes this as a milestone in the development of the trading bloc. It was welcomed as opening a new chapter in our integration by Lula da Silva, the Brazilian president. There was a meeting in Uruguay recently convened to mark Venezuela's formal entry into Mercosur. Venezuelan President Chavez said that we cannot allow this to be purely an economic project, one for the elites and for the transnational companies. It's a not very oblique reference to the U.S.-sponsored, what's called the Free Trade Area for the Americas, which is highly unpopular in Latin America. Venezuela also supplied Argentina with oil to help stave off an energy crisis, and more important, it bought a large part of Argentina's debt. That's one element of a region-wide effort to free the countries from the controls of the IMF after 2 decades of disastrous effects of conformity to the rules imposed by the U.S.-dominated international financial institutions. The IMF has acted towards our country as a promoter and a vehicle of policies that cause poverty and pain among the Argentine people, President Kirchner just said, in announcing his decision to pay off about $1 trillion, in his words, to rid itself of the IMF forever, and radically violating IMF rules. Argentina has enjoyed a substantial economic recovery from the disaster left by IMF policies. Steps towards independent regional integration took another important step forward in December with the election of Evo Morales. He's the first Bolivian president from the indigenous majority. Morales moved very quickly to reach a series of energy accords with Venezuela. Bolivia's gas reserves are the second largest in South America after Venezuela. And he too is committed publicly to reversing the neoliberal policies that Bolivia had pursued rigorously for 25 years, leaving the country with lower per capita income than at the outset. Well, much of the region from Venezuela to Argentina now has left-center governments. Furthermore, the indigenous population have for the first time become quite active and influential, particularly in Bolivia and Ecuador. Bolivia, they had an election far more democratic than anything we can even conceive of in the United States. That's worth thinking about. Both Bolivia and Ecuador are major energy producers, and the indigenous population either want to control the resources themselves or just not have them develop. Large parts of what is now emerging as a kind of an Indian nation, much of it just doesn't see any reason why their societies and their cultures should be destroyed so that people can sit in gridlock in their SUVs in New York.
Right.
Extremely important in developing international affairs. As I mentioned, this internal economic integration that's going on is reversing patterns that go straight back to the Spanish conquest. Latin American elites and economies had been linked to the imperial powers, but not to one another, and that's beginning to change. And Washington's traditional methods of control, namely violence and economic strangulation, are losing their effectiveness. The last time Washington tried a military coup, was in 2002 in Venezuela. I had to back down quickly, partly because it was overthrown at once, but partly because of enormous opposition in Latin America, where they just have a different conception of democracy than here. Military dictatorship. And losing that weapon, and losing the weapon of economic strangulation, IMF rules and others, that means that the means of control are diminishing. They're not eliminated. In fact, it's a pretty important topic. It's too late to go into it, but there's a sharp expansion of U.S. military personnel, training Latin American officers going on all over the region, and you can think of some of the things they may be up to, but it's not as easy as it was in the past. So like in the early 60s, Brazil had a moderately populist president, Goulart, and the Kennedy administration just organized a military coup which overthrew him, established a kind of neo-Nazi security state, spread throughout the continent. You can't do that so easily anymore. And if the IMF controls are lost, that's the second weapon. Oh, that's really serious. For many reasons, the whole system of global dominance is quite fragile, even apart from the damage that's been inflicted on it by Bush planners. Well, when you look over the whole record of policy and forget about the rhetorical frame, what you find is pretty straightforward. The guiding principles are that democracy is fine abroad, but only when it takes a certain form, a form that doesn't risk popular interference with the primary interests of wealth and power. So if it's formal democracy with no substance, that's fine, cheered. And at home, much the same doctrine prevails. Well, there's no time to go into that critical matter.